He lived a life of contradictions. He believed in the Union, yet fought against it. He is remembered only as a Southerner, though he lived for years in the North and West. He is rightly regarded as a military genius, but his most famous battle ended in dramatic defeat. He spent many years in obscurity, yet in death he became larger than life. He lives on now as a revered legend, a legend that sometimes clouds the realities of his eventful life and complex character. His name was Robert E. Lee. He was born in 1807 at Stratford Hall, a gracious Virginia estate, into a family with a rich heritage and strong ties to Virginia's and America's colonial and revolutionary past. His mother, Anne Hill Carter, belonged to one of the young nation's wealthiest families. His father, Henry Lee, served as a cavalry officer in the American Army during the Revolution. His daring exploits earned him the nickname Light Horse Harry. When the two married at Shirley Plantation on the James River in 1793, George Washington, a friend of both families, bid them good fortune. It was not to be. Though Light Horse Harry possessed considerable talent as a soldier, he was less proficient as a businessman. He made a series of investments that threatened the family's fortune and reputation. At one point, he even wrote a bad check to his friend, George Washington. Nevertheless, Henry Lee achieved political prominence.
He, of course, became governor of Virginia. He was an outstanding politician, and like most Virginians who had wealth, he invested in the West, and of course, it failed.
In declining health, Anne Carter Lee moved her family, including her fifth child, Robert, to a modest home in the city of Alexandria, Virginia, near the nation's capital. When Henry Lee died in 1818, 11-year-old Robert became the ceremonial head of the household, one now rich in tradition only. Young Robert was earnest, bright, and devoted to his studies and to caring for his invalid mother. He regularly attended nearby Christ Church, and neighbors remembered him as serious about his schoolwork and all other matters. With his family's history of military service and now scarce financial resources, Robert developed an interest in a military career. His studiousness and family name and connections helped him win an appointment to the United States Military Academy. In 1825, at age 18, Robert E. Lee arrived at West Point and began to compile an exemplary record. He excelled at his classwork and maintained a flawless demeanor, never receiving a single demerit. Widely respected, he was selected as adjutant of the Corps as an upperclassman, a considerable honor. When he graduated in 1829, second in his class, his impressive credentials earned him a place with the engineers, the Army's elite corps. He also earned the hand of Mary Ann Randolph Custis, a prominent young Virginian whose family history surpassed even that of her young suitor. Her father, George Washington Parke Custis, lived as an infant orphan with his grandmother Martha and her second husband, George Washington, at Mount Vernon. In later years, Custis became obsessed with the heritage of his adopted father. He collected vast amounts of Washington memorabilia at his hilltop house above the Potomac River, overlooking the city of Washington. It was in this house, Arlington, that Mary Custis grew up. And it was here, too, that Mary Custis, wealthy heiress to the legacy of George Washington, married an Army lieutenant of decidedly modest financial means, Robert E. Lee. Lee's military career carried him across the nation. His first assignment took him to the wetlands downstream from Savannah, Georgia, where he helped lay out a massive coastal bastion on Cockspur Island, destined to become Fort Pulaski. Later assignments took him to Virginia, Michigan, Ohio, and New York. For the most part, he traveled alone. Mary remained at Arlington, overseeing domestic affairs and tending their growing family. The long separations took their toll on their marriage.
The General and Mrs. Lee loved each other intensely. And if you look back at his life, you'll see that much of their time they were apart, and they had to carry on a relationship, by letter. And so you have these long series of Lee's letters in which he's almost straining and trying to make sure that he's being a good father and being a good husband.
After a decade and a half, Lee found Army life to be increasingly tedious and routine. War with Mexico changed all that. In that conflict, he served with distinction, taking part in engagements at Veracruz, Churubusco, and Chapultepec. His superiors honored him for his leadership, and General Winfield Scott, commander of the U.S. forces, called Lee the very best soldier I ever saw in the field. Lee had found his calling. After the war, Lee went to Baltimore for 4 years and then returned to West Point to take up residence as superintendent of the military academy. He served for 3 years at this post, upgrading both academic programs and the physical plant. In 1855, Lee transferred to Texas as lieutenant colonel of the 2nd U.S. Cavalry. As he traveled westward, the nation across which he passed was becoming increasingly polarized over the social, political, and economic issues, especially slavery, which were taking it to the brink of disunion and the nation's bloodiest war, a war to be fought among its own people. In October 1859, the country passed a clear marker that it was on the road to war. In Western Virginia, a man named John Brown led a small band of his abolitionist followers to storm the federal arsenal and armory at Harper's Ferry, hoping to spark and arm a slave rebellion. President James Buchanan dispatched a force of United States Marines to end the insurrection. Lee, who at the moment happened to be at Arlington, received command of the detail. The Marines quickly restored order in Harper's Ferry and captured Brown and his band. Lee returned to Washington. Brown and several of his followers were hanged. John Brown quickly became a symbol of the growing importance of the slavery issue in the country, an issue that troubled Lee profoundly.
Lee's relationship with slavery was very complicated. On one hand, he was a member of the gentry. He was a member of the class of Southerners who benefited very, very greatly from slavery in economic terms, in political terms, in social terms. And yet he was not a particular proponent of slavery.
He felt that slavery was wrong, even though his wife had inherited large numbers of slaves, and he, as head of the family, was basically the manager of that slave estate at Arlington, Virginia. Nevertheless, Lee was not a believer in slavery, and he had a long-term plan to emancipate these slaves voluntarily, a plan that was interrupted by the war, and eventually, of course, they were emancipated by the action of the war and the 13th Amendment.
Lee also harbored ambivalent feelings about the United States. Though a staunch patriot, he reserved his strongest emotions for his native Virginia. As he returned to Texas in 1860, conflicting loyalties to the Army, his country, the South, and Virginia fueled his hope for a peaceful resolution of the sectional crisis. But events forced his hand. In December 1860, South Carolina left the Union. Within a few weeks, 6 other Deep South states had also seceded. Lee returned to Washington, where he learned of the Confederate attack on Fort Sumter. President Lincoln called for volunteers to suppress the rebellion, prompting 4 more Southern states, including Virginia, to secede. On April 18th, one day after Virginia's fateful decision, Lee arrived at the home of Francis P. Blair in Washington, where he was offered command of the field army being assembled. Lee declined. 2 days later, at Arlington House, he wrote the letter of resignation that ended his 36-year military career.
The state of Virginia had seceded, and Lee decided that he could not fight against his family, his friends, his state. And although he was not enthusiastic about secession, in fact he had opposed it in principle, and he was not enthusiastic about the institution of slavery, he opposed that also in principle, he nevertheless decided to go with his state, and of course we know that he became the outstanding commander of the Confederate Army.
2 days after his resignation, Lee left to join the Southern cause. He was never again to return to Arlington House. Lee moved his family to Richmond, and his Confederate military career began inauspiciously.
Then he sent up to coordinate things in West Virginia. Well, that's horrendous terrain for these armies. He has mediocre people to work with up there. He runs into bad weather, and he doesn't have a track record that will give him much credibility.
The mountains of Western Virginia, Wilfer's subordinates had proved too much for him. He comes back with his horse, we acquired out there, Traveler, but with a reputation and known as either Granny Lee or evacuating Lee. He returned to Richmond, and with northern naval operations that resulted in the capture of Port Royal Sound, he is ordered to South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida to defend these areas against Union naval power and amphibious expeditions. And as a good engineer, he begins erecting fortifications to guard the principal ports and harbors. But there's little glamour in this, and he soon became known as the King of Spades.
Jefferson Davis, Lee's West Point contemporary and the President of the Confederate States, recalled Lee to Richmond. Lee's military genius began to emerge that spring when Union General George B. McClellan's mighty army threatened the Confederate capital from the east. Lee helped prepare the city's defenses and suggested a diversionary campaign for Stonewall Jackson in the Shenandoah Valley of Western Virginia. Jackson's brilliant execution of Lee's concept so alarmed the Lincoln administration that it redirected troops to meet Jackson's threat, a threat less real than perceived. This decision deprived McClellan of forces that he regarded as crucial to the success of his operation and effectively ended the immediate threat to Richmond. When Confederate General Joseph E. Johnston was wounded in an inconclusive engagement with McClellan's troops at Seven Pines, Lee replaced him. Within a matter of weeks, he galvanized Johnston's hodgepodge of forces into the Army of Northern Virginia and boldly assailed McClellan's columns. Fighting in broken, often swampy terrain in a series of clashes that became known as the 7 Days Battles, Lee's forces confronted McClellan's between June 26th and July 1st. Despite tactical setbacks at places such as Beaver Dam Creek, White Oak Swamp, and the climactic battle at Malvern Hill, Lee's bold assaults drove the Federals into a fortified camp at Harrison's Landing on the James River, ending McClellan's immediate threat to Richmond. At a cost of more than 20,000 Confederate casualties, Richmond was saved, and Lee a hero. In the meantime, President Lincoln constituted a new federal army under General John Pope and positioned it between the Rappahannock and Rapidan rivers of northern Virginia. Boldly deciding to confront this new threat, Lee divided his army, giving command of half of it to Stonewall Jackson. First, Jackson's force, then Lee, riding with General James Longstreet's wing, went north to engage Pope. North and South clashed again at Manassas. In some of the heaviest infantry fighting of the war, the Confederates inflicted frightful losses on Pope's troops. The Federals retreated into Washington's fortifications. In 2 months, Lee had taken the war from the gates of Richmond to the outskirts of Washington. Although the victory at Second Manassas was sweeping, it was not decisive. Lee knew that the Confederacy could not prevail in a war of attrition against the more populous and industrial North. He and others believed that a decisive victory on Northern soil might bring European recognition and much-needed European aid to the Confederate States.
Lee knew that if he could win one more victory, as he had already won 2 spectacular victories at the 7 Days and at Second Manassas, and this one on what the North considered to be Union soil, that he would bring about that recognition.
In early September, his army invaded Maryland. Lee's men met McClellan's near Sharpsburg, along a creek called Antietam. In fighting that raged through cornfields, around the Dunker Church, across a sunken farm road that came to be known as Bloody Lane, and along the banks of the Antietam, the two armies fought ferociously. When the sun set at last, more than 23,000 Americans were counted as casualties, the bloodiest single day of the Civil War. The battle was crucial in many ways, especially because President Lincoln had been quietly waiting for a major victory before issuing a preliminary Emancipation Proclamation.
Antietam turned out to be that victory, and Lincoln did issue the Emancipation Proclamation. It also turned out to be the victory for the North. Even though it was a tactical draw, it was a strategic victory of the North because it forced Lee to retreat to Virginia. That prevented the European governments from making that offer of mediation or from offering diplomatic recognition of the Confederacy, and they never did through the rest of the war. That defeated one of the Confederacy's major foreign policy goals. And it also prevented the Democrats from winning control of the House of Representatives in the Northern congressional elections. So it turned out to be one of the major turning points of the war in all of these respects.
For Lee's army, though, the year was not over yet. In December 1862, the Army of Northern Virginia took a defensive stance against a Richmond-bound Union force under Ambrose Burnside. From remarkably strong positions on the heights west and south of the town, Lee's forces repulsed wave after wave of Union troops in a murderous affair. During the bloody battle, Lee observed, "It is well that war is so terrible, else we should grow too fond of it." The victory at Fredericksburg heartened the Confederate soldiers. But Lee's own optimism was tempered by the failing health of his wife, Mary, who was confined to a wheelchair by arthritis. The brunt of winter rolled in, harshly taxing the civilian population of Richmond and much of the South. Fighting resumed in the spring of 1863, when Fighting Joe Hooker's army of 130,000 men met Lee's forces west of Fredericksburg. Boldly separating and reuniting his army in the dense woods near a tavern called Chancellorsville, Lee hurled back an isolated wing of Union troops, overawed Hooker, and sent the Federals retreating northward. Lee's brilliant strategy earned him his greatest moment as a general. Yet the victory was marred by tragedy. In the midst of triumph, Lee lost his finest lieutenant, Stonewall Jackson, who fell mortally wounded by the mistaken fire of his own troops on May 2nd. He died 8 days later. Lee followed Chancellorsville with his greatest gamble. His army needed supplies. He and others reasoned that a victory in the North might spark the rising peace movement into compromise with the Confederacy. Lee looked northward again, this time to Pennsylvania. Entering the state in late June 1863, his army soon stumbled onto Federal troops near a crossroads town called Gettysburg. On July 1st, the Confederates drove the Federals from the field, but failed to capitalize on their victory, allowing the Northerners to occupy high ground south of town. Buttressed by reinforcements that evening, the Union position became formidable. The next day, Lee discovered how formidable. In attacks against the Union left, near the two Round Tops, his troops encountered fierce resistance. In close quarters fighting at Little Round Top, the Peach Orchard, the Wheat Field, Devil's Den, and late in the day on the Union right, the Federals held. When evening came to Lee's camps along Seminary Ridge, the Confederates had gained little. The next day, July 3rd, 1863, Lee made his worst military mistake. Unintimidated by the tenacity of the Union defense, he pitched his army against the center of the Federal position on Cemetery Ridge. The attack, known to history as Pickett's Charge, ended in disaster. About half of the 12,000 Confederates who set out against the Union line returned. For Lee, the stunning defeat cost more than the thousands of lives lost on Pennsylvania soil. Gettysburg erased the myth of invincibility nourished by the Army of Northern Virginia and borne out by Lee's personal example. Gone, too, was Lee's hope for achieving an offensive victory in the North. (1864) brought Lee face to face with his most formidable Northern foe, Ulysses S. Grant. The North's quiet, confident hero of the Western War, a veteran of Forts Henry and Donelson, of Shiloh, Vicksburg, and Chattanooga, came east in March to command the Union armies. The two generals had met once before, during the Mexican War, when both had worn the same uniform. Now, they were to meet again on the field of battle. They did so first in the wilderness west of Fredericksburg. During 2 days of confused fighting in bewildering, sometimes burning thickets, Lee's army repulsed the Federals, inflicting terrible losses. The fighting continued through the next 2 weeks in fields and woods surrounding nearby Spotsylvania Courthouse. Grant's army probed and assaulted Lee's long fortified lines, absorbing hideous losses, but robbing the Confederates of their potential offensive power in the process. Though his army held against the onslaught, Lee's prospects dimmed. Hope lingered that the fall elections in the North might reflect a rising tide in the peace movement, offering the possibility of negotiated peace. But in the face of Grant's steadily reinforced aggressive army, Lee moved ever southward, taking up defensive positions nearer the Confederate capital. Grant next struck Lee at Cold Harbor, just east of Richmond. The assault against strong earthworks was tantamount to suicide. The Union suffered nearly 7,000 casualties in 30 minutes, but Grant pressed on. He crossed the James River in mid-June and closed in on Petersburg, the back door to Richmond. Lee positioned his battered army around the town and dug in. He knew that his soldiers might not withstand a protracted siege, but he had little choice. Protracted it was. Throughout the fall and winter, Grant slowly extended the tentacles of his army, gradually choking Lee's dwindling supplies. In March 1865, the Confederate government named Lee to command all Confederate armies. But with peace negotiations ended and General William T. Sherman thrusting deep into North Carolina, hope for the Confederacy faded. The end came quickly. On March 25th, Lee directed his last ground assault. The target? Union-held Fort Stedman east of Petersburg. The attack failed. A week later, Union victory at Five Forks doomed Petersburg. On April 2nd and 3rd, Confederate authorities evacuated Richmond in the midst of devastating fire. The remnants of Lee's army retreated westward, hoping to work their way south to join up with Confederate troops in North Carolina. At Sailor's Creek, Union forces under Philip Sheridan and George G. Meade caught up with Lee, taking nearly 8,000 prisoners in what proved to be the final major battle for the Army of Northern Virginia. Facing the inevitable, Lee surrendered to Grant 3 days later in the McLean House at Appomattox Courthouse. Of the surrender, Grant later wrote, "What General Lee's feelings were, I do not know. As he was a man of much dignity, with an impassible face, it was impossible to say whether he felt inwardly glad that the end had finally come, or felt sad over the result, and was too manly to show it. Whatever his feelings, they were entirely concealed from my observation." Others in the bedraggled army of Northern Virginia showed less restraint. When the surrender was announced, many wept openly. At Appomattox, for all practical purposes, the war ended. By early summer, the last organized Confederate forces had surrendered. Robert and Mary Lee eventually moved to Lexington, Virginia after the war, where Lee assumed the presidency of Washington College. A progressive educator, he devoted himself to building the school, his symbol of the South's new hope. He counseled his fellow veterans to put the war behind them and rebuild the land. He also devoted himself to attending his ailing wife, Mary.
And I think that that gives to me a secret of Lee's character, and it goes back to his mother, who also was very, very ill. And as you know, Lee's father had problems, and Lee had to take care of his mother. And when Lee went off to West Point, his mother wrote, "Oh, what should I do now that Robert is going? He has been both a son and a daughter to me." So you have a man who was one of the great 19th century, who also was a nurturer.
As Mary's health declined, so too did his. The morning of October 12, 1870, the bedridden Lee turned to anxious observers and said, "Strike the tent." Then he passed away. Mary died 3 years later. Both are buried in the school's chapel, now named Washington and Lee University. In many ways, Lee's funeral signaled the end of an era and the birth of a legend. As time passed, Lee became less a person and more a symbol of a lost way of life.
He represented everything that was noble and good about the past. But he would not have fit in the late 19th or early 20th centuries. He was a provincial in a time of growing nationalism. He was a gentleman at a time when the qualities and the values that he admired were rapidly passing out of existence.
Federal officials acted less graciously in victory than Lee had in defeat. The grounds at Arlington became our most prominent national cemetery. Although Lee took a loyalty oath to the United States less than 6 months after Appomattox, his citizenship was not restored for more than a century. Lee's former home at Arlington now stands restored as a memorial to an extraordinary soldier and an extraordinary man.